Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. My pronouns are he, him, his. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and I hope that you and yours are staying safe and healthy. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. You'll also see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. We're excited to present this webinar on being a linguist on social media. Our panelists will provide a brief introduction to social media with a particular focus on Linguist Twitter. You'll come away from this webinar with an overview of some of the benefits and pitfalls of social media, as well as pointers for social media etiquette. Our panelists will discuss how social media can benefit your research, teaching, networking, and community building. Expanded access to this webinar is supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 1924593. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. I want to take just a few minutes now to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. If you'd like to download copies of the introductory slides and the panelists' presentations, you'll find them in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar dashboard. We will also have them available after the webinar, and I'll send you a link to them then as well. You may have noticed that your microphones are muted. This is so we don't get miscellaneous background noise from dogs, traffic, children, and whatnot. We do encourage you to ask questions at any time. There is a questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard that you can use. I'll pass the questions along to the panelists who will answer them during the last 45 minutes of the webinar. And remember, if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn the floor and the screen over to our first speaker, who is Betsy Sneller of Michigan State University. We've had a little technical issue, and Betsy is available on audio, but her camera, she couldn't get her camera connected, so we will not have her video. So Betsy, take it away, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. Can you guys see the presentation? Oh, whoops.
We could just now we have your screen, your whole screen again.
Sorry, I don't know where that went. Let me pull it up one more time. And try this. Does that work?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that y'all are here. Quick note about the 5 of us who are presenting today. We're not social media influencers. We're just linguists on social media, and our aim is to help make social media, and in particular Twitter, maximally accessible to other linguists as well. So we're talking about social media with a specific focus on Linguist Twitter, and we know that Twitter in particular, but social media also can be intimidating, and our goal here is to just demystify it. We're going to highlight some, as David said, some potential benefits and potential pitfalls, and this applies to everyone who considers themselves a linguist, so graduate students, postdocs, faculty, institutions, and the linguistics community beyond academia as well. We're going to provide some general advice and basic takeaways. Quick note, we used a Google form to elicit some comments from users of Linguist Twitter that are used throughout this presentation. So we got 28 responses, and we'll be including some quotes, some selected quotes from people on the good things and the bad things about Linguist Twitter throughout. And then we'll end with a question and answer period that will allow you to direct the topics that we'll dig deeper into. Okay, so to start, social media. There's a bunch of different social medias, and they all have their own kind of genre. So Facebook is kind of like being in a conversation at a house party. So you and your friends have all been invited, y'all can weigh in, and the people who haven't been invited are excluded from the conversation. The one exception to this is sometimes conversations can happen via Facebook groups and Facebook events. And these can be a little bit more public, kind of halfway to Twitter. Twitter, on the other hand, is like a conversation that you're having in a public park. Anyone can hear, anyone can jump in and participate. So see, for instance, Maria Heath, amongst others, work on Twitter as kind of a spoken medium. There's other social medias as well, things like Instagram and TikTok, which we're not going to get into today, but these are venues that tend to be a little bit more creative or personal, although definitely also possible to use for a professional or institutional persona. And one brief note that I want to say, and I think either Kelly or Megan will get to as well, that your persona on social media is not in conflict with your academic life. So it's possible to, for instance, share personal things about yourself, and you don't have to feel like this is in conflict with you as an academic. And then email is another type of social media, which tends to be a little bit more formal, although many people have a distinction between their personal email and their work email, for instance. But as we said, there's going to be a particular focus on Twitter. So Twitter in particular can tend to be a little bit the most informal or a little bit snarky, and it can be a little bit easy to misread a tweet if you're not used to it. So just know going in that the style of this medium is a little bit cheeky, a little bit more cheeky. Okay, so let's start. One way that Linguist Twitter can be awesome for you is for your research. There's some evidence that tweeted papers get cited more. There's an asterisk there because it turns out to be a little bit field dependent. But also journals who have their own Twitter presence can end up getting their papers cited more. So for instance, Language has a Twitter presence. That's awesome for people who get published in Language. Y'all should know there is a science Twitter norm in general that when a paper comes out, you can tweet storm a paper. So this typically includes the main arguments of the paper, any important figures, kind of giving a teaser of the paper and inviting people to jump in or to check out your actual paper. So here's an example of that. A paper that I published with Gareth Roberts came out recently, and so Gareth tweet stormed it. So first tweet was, hey, here's the link to the paper, and then a series of tweets in order outlining what the main argument of the paper is, so that if you're interested in any particular argument, you could follow up and follow along. You can also use Twitter to crowdsource papers and projects and grant ideas. So here we have Rachel Weissler crowdsourcing ideas. So she says, University of Michigan folks, I'm looking for an electrical or fabrication engineers interested in applying for grant funding for cross-disciplinary research focused on racial inequality. Our project is manufacturing EEG caps for all hair types, specifically for, but not limited to, Afrocentric hair. So this is an example of somebody using Twitter to reach out to unknown collaborators, inviting them to jump in. It can also be super useful for crowdsourcing papers. So this is a tweet from Lisa Davidson. And I'll say all the tweets that we're showing, we got permission to show. So this tweet says, sociolinguists, you know how there are dialects of American English where people can say rotten and kitten instead of rotten and kitten. Does anyone know where there is a paper where this has been observed? If I have an idea and don't know a citation for it, Linguist Twitter is the fastest way to get relevant papers on that idea. You can also get lots of research ideas from Twitter. So we got some comments from our Google form. One person said, Twitter is awesome for asking for a place to start with a line of research or a methodological skill and getting 1 or 2 retweets that actually leads to dozens of awesome responses. Someone else said, my live tweeting a department talk led to a colleague who's not on Twitter having a research collaboration with someone who saw my tweets. So the impacts can expand beyond Twitter as well. Twitter can also be great for data collection. So a lot of people use Twitter to gather acceptability judgments and find out about especially things like regionalism from their pool of Twitter followers. There are some potential pitfalls. The main one being that Twitter is the same as talking about out loud, as I said, but it's more permanent and it's more public, right? So just be aware that the things that you write on the internet exist forever. People can take screenshots of it. So you might want to be a little bit careful about what you're saying. There's also the potential that other people might misrepresent your research, but this is only a slight pitfall because the public nature of Twitter lets you actually follow up to potentially correct any misunderstandings. So there's some good and then some bad. So I'm going to now turn it over to Nicole, who's going to be talking about the next section of why Linguist Twitter is excellent.
Hi, thank you so much, Betsy. This is so fun to be here with you all. So we all that are presenting today use Twitter and other social media for a variety of functions, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what its utility is for your teaching in particular. We'll get back there. Okay, so one of the ways that it's particularly useful for your teaching is in syllabus creation. Some of the comments that we got from the folks that we got comments from say that it's been helpful for connecting more widely with the academic community outside linguistics, particularly on issues of pedagogy and justice. So talking to other people who are interested in pedagogy that aren't necessarily in the linguistics community usually. Another person told us, I crowdsourced a lot of my teaching, especially about decolonizing my modules. So thinking beyond your own experience, you can get some ideas for the types of things that you might want to include on a syllabus that might not be in your area of expertise, sort of casting a wider net in that way. They can also be useful for soliciting guest lectures. I have done this myself. People say I've connected with people for setting up guest lectures in my class. There are people who do totally different types of linguistics than what I do that I've seen on Twitter and that I engage with regularly that I've talked to about coming to talk to my class. So it's actually pretty nice if you feel kind of awkward about sending an email to somebody you don't know. If you have seen them on Twitter or been involved with conversations with them on Twitter, I think it kind of breaks the ice in that way to try to say like, hey, why don't you come and talk to my class and maybe I'll come and talk to your class and, you know, kind of forge connections in that way. There's a few best practices in terms of using Twitter for your teaching that we want to talk about. So one thing is getting ideas for online teaching. So recently, Kirby Conrad posted getting people to talk in Zoom class tips thread. I'll share mine and you share yours, please. We are all in the struggle with this right now, right? Like just blank faces staring at us all the time. So Kirby says, tip 1, in breakout rooms, ask one person to manage the screen share or whiteboard. They go on to share some more tips that have been useful to them. My favorite one of these is any Zoom meeting longer than 40 minutes needs a break. I don't even realize how tired I am after I've been on Zoom for an hour. So just, you know, kind of in this way, getting ideas about teaching, but also noticing that your practices are maybe could be improved with tips from others, I guess. They're also useful for making example sentences more inclusive. So I had seen this tweet by Adas Kotek that said about the new paper that they had with a few other linguists about gender bias and stereotype in linguistic example sentences. We all have seen examples of semi-problematic example sentences. And then I replied to this tweet and with one of my favorite example sentences that says, one of my favorites to demonstrate contrastive focus is Terrence hugged Jamal, taking down toxic masculinity and white supremacy in one fell swoop. So this gets to a little bit of what Betsy was saying, that the tone on Twitter can be a little snarky. Like I'm talking about something that I really use in class, but kind of in a hyperbolic way about, you know, like we're going to end racism with example sentences. But these things matter, right? And I'm really happy to have found out about their paper and engaged with them around that on Twitter. Another best practice can be for compensating labor. So we see here a tweet from one of my favorite people, Josh Rockla, and he asked folks who are inviting guest lecturers to Zoom into your courses, what would payment look like for an hour-long class? A lot of people that saw this tweet maybe had never considered that it might be helpful to compensate guest lecturers, particularly in, you know, the current situation. And so he got an idea of what people in the field thought was appropriate compensation for this. So not only just normalizing the fact that we should compensate labor, but also kind of figuring out how much he thought it was appropriate to pay people, especially people who are early in their career who might not have you know, a lot of opportunities like this, or you know, kind of need more promotion as well as more money, because we've all had that experience as students. Another thing that can be interesting for your teaching is getting timely and interesting content and having some new thinking on topics you're interested in. So I have gotten a lot of information about just various things that I would have never thought of that are of interest to my students. As some of you may have seen, Pratt changed its logo the other day, and lots of people had to update their slides because they were teaching Pratt. I first learned about that from Twitter, and I didn't want to be behind the curve with using the old logo. So keeping us on top of things that might be relevant for our students. Twitter lists and hashtags can also be useful for keeping track of the kind of tweets that you want to follow, the kind of people that share information that may be of interest to you. A couple of potential pitfalls for your teaching. Your students may find you on Twitter, depending on what kind of presence you maintain there. That can be a potential benefit. I did recently have a former student see that I had given a presentation for Duolingo a couple weeks ago, and the student saw it, and he had a point of entry then to email me and say, oh my gosh, you know, I saw your talk, it was so interesting. And then we had a meeting to talk about you know, his future grad school plans. And this was awesome because I think it may have been more difficult for him to reach out if he didn't know what I was up to, but because he followed me on Twitter, it gave him a point of entry, and we had something to talk about and didn't have an awkward conversation. That was just, you know, he didn't feel like he had to put me out by asking me for something. We were just staying in touch. So that can be a benefit. And you know, you do want to remember that anyone can read your tweets, including your bosses, you know, as much as that works in academia. I shared with the group when we were preparing this that my mom is always kind of like, you shouldn't talk about politics on the internet because of your career prospects. And I'm like, well, I think if you don't know what my politics are from my writing, you haven't read my writing. So for me, this may not be a potential pitfall, but it might be for you, depending on, you know, the kind of context that you exist in and the kind of research that you do. So next, I'm going to throw it to Kelly, that's going to talk about networking.
Actually, it's me.
Sorry, Megan, it's you.
No problem. Hi, everyone. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Just wanted to say that. And I'm so happy to be here with everyone because I'm pretty sure it's just all my friends on Twitter. Let me talk about networking. So you get to meet new linguists who do work just like yours. I actually recently have been DMing someone because we're gonna do a paper together because we found out we're interested in the same thing. So someone also said, I've really enjoyed interacting with so many different linguists. We're all kind of silly on there, but we also support each other and are happy to help out when asked. I have found that Linguist Twitter has been so helpful. Just like Betsy and Nicole were talking about, when you crowdsource things for your syllabus or ask about, you know, guest lectures and all of that, people are willing to help out, willing to retweet, that kind of thing. So it's been really helpful. And I've been able to set up my database. I have scholars to read in the field of linguistics or of language because of Twitter and people helping me on find people to put on there. So yeah. This is so important. So avoid subfield siloing. I have learned so much from Twitter because I get to hear from my deaf colleagues that are working on sign languages. It's always good to remember when I'm, you know, I do child language acquisition. So to remember that it's not just spoken language, right? Someone said networking is great. I've communicated with individuals and discovered work that I would not have easily discovered. Just like I've been able to talk with sociolinguists. It's been so nice because that's not something I had access to in my program when I was doing my PhD. And now I know so many sociolinguists who can point me to things. I asked someone like, I asked Twitter, what's the best thing to elicit speech? And, you know, I get all these great sociolinguists helping me out, finding what, you know, the best elicitation devices that I could use. And it makes you a better researcher. If you are someone who does semantics, it doesn't hurt to have sociolinguists out there commenting on something you might tweet about that'll help expand your research. So that's also very important. Placement opportunities. All right, so Twitter is a great way to announce an open position, to find open positions, whether it's if you're an undergrad or if you're looking for a postdoc or looking for a lab manager position. Those things are shared on Twitter. They get retweeted, so more people have access to that. Like Betsy and Nicole were talking about, maybe guest lectures or invited talks. So far I've had 2 invitations to write for an academic journal because of a tweet that I tweeted about child language acquisition. So you never know what tweet might get you an invited talk, or have someone be like, hey, that's really interesting, can we talk more about this? So that's another really helpful thing that Twitter helps us with. Next. Okay, so this is my favorite one. Twitter is so great for conferences. You get to follow talks. You know how you're at a conference and there are concurrent sessions, so you can't be at both, obviously, because you're only human. So then you could look at Twitter and someone's live tweeting the other talk that you couldn't go to. You can look at them later. Hashtags are really good for this, right? So you can search Twitter for the hashtag that the conference has given out. So LSA 2020 or whatever. And then you can just see everyone that's tweeting about that. And the whole I know you from Twitter thing happens a lot at conferences. So there's a tweet here. Eris Clemens says, I'm very happy that LSA 2021 is virtual and very sad that I won't get to meet you in person and see you present. And then Kelly says, oh gosh, same. I'm very happy it is online, but missing out on the fellowship of it is a real letdown, but someday we'll be together. Let's all hope. I don't know. But so, yeah, so having a virtual conference is also nice because it's more accessible, which I'll talk about in a second. But the whole I know you from Twitter happens a lot at these conferences. And also people will meet people at conferences and then follow them on Twitter. And then the kind of connections that I've already talked about and Betsy and Nicole have already talked about can happen on Twitter because you met someone at a conference. But it's just a really great way. I actually started using Twitter after LSA like 2016 or something because I was like, this is so helpful. I hated Twitter before then, but I got to meet so many awesome people because I was following the LSA hashtag. So. Okay, and it also helps to understand the context of the field. So someone told us the most precious aspect of #Ling Twitter is related to linguistics as a profession, knowing the discussions that happen in the backstage of academia. So you kind of get the scoop and the gossip when you're on Linguist Twitter. You also, again, have people are retweeting fellowships, or, you're gonna get an inside scoop from like professors who talk about recommendation letters and how that whole process works and how frustrating it is. So you get to see that kind of stuff, which can be really helpful and demystifying. And then a potential pitfall is that you will lose faith, someone says, in a lot of your academic superheroes after reading their terrible opinions. I actually think this is a benefit, but you might think of it as a pitfall. Yeah, sometimes it's very disappointing. And this is like a subtweet, I guess. Okay, accessibility. So it cannot be understated how important Twitter has been, or Twitter has been, for accessibility. It makes conferences so much more accessible for many people. So deaf linguists, we had someone write to us, as a deaf linguist who finds live conferences mainly inaccessible, Twitter has been an amazing virtual conference coffee break for me. I've connected with so many linguists and other academics in related fields. Even while at actual conferences, the live tweeting trend is a lifesaver for me. So there's another, the live tweeting sessions is also really helpful for deaf linguists. And Julie Hawkins, I'm so sorry, Hawkinsane says, it has been a great equalizer for me as a deaf academic. Many conferences and other academic events are inaccessible to me, so Twitter becomes my conference coffee break where I can retweet with others. It has been a game changer for me. And they go on to say, it also keeps me in touch with my international colleagues without having to emoji fly. So many of their tweets have been more inspiring, thought-provoking, funny, life-changing than they will ever know. I often share them with my domestic colleagues, especially grad students in class. And so again, there are also neurodivergent folks who find that conferences can be more accessible because they can follow along on Linguist Twitter. I actually have found it that it's so much easier to meet someone at a conference if I've already talked to them on Twitter, or we've just retweeted each other. It'll be like, hey, I know you from Twitter. So that's also helpful. And then finally, we have international conferences. So money, visa, environment, time, these are reasons why we might not be able to go to conferences, but we still want to learn the stuff that is being said and shared at these conferences. Well, we can follow the hashtag. So someone said, I registered on Twitter before TISLR conference in 2019 because I was accepted at the conference, but denied a European visa. But thanks to the sign linguistics community, I was able to post my poster video in advance, monitor the conference on Twitter, and even participate in discussions. Special thanks go to Dr. John Hanner's account. So, this is really important right now because we know that, like the US is just like a dumpster fire before. We were having visa issues. So a lot of people from abroad couldn't come to our conferences, but this is a way that can be accessible, even if they can't make it. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to Kelly now.
Kelly, we can't hear you.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm Kelly, she, her, hers. Thank you, Megan. I'm going to talk to you all about community building. So I joined Twitter late in December 2017 because the LSA suggested it for 5-Minute Linguist. So my first experiences on Twitter were all of these wonderful conference connections that people have been talking about. And I was really off Twitter for a while after that until Kelly Yoshida tagged me into a conversation, and there's a tweet here about that. Tagged me into a conversation with a group of linguists who are also cancers. And so she really created a community, called us into being, and pulled me back onto Twitter, and I'm so happy that she did. So Linguist Twitter is really a community, and we've got some quotes here from our survey. Quote, I learn a lot about how to be a better person from the people I follow. So Megan really just described how that is talking about accessibility. We also hear, quote, follow positive accounts and accounts of people you admire, professional and otherwise. And quote, I also like that Linguist Twitter makes alt-ac linguists visible. As I approach the end of my graduate program, I'm hopeful that I won't necessarily fade into obscurity when the market eats me alive and I don't make it. So the good thing about this community is it really brings us all together. We've got like vertical and horizontal integration across the language lovers of the world, which is absolutely wonderful. So the best part about it is we're people, right? Linguist Twitter really brings together the humans behind the research. And so we hear, quote, as much as it is very academic, I think it gives a human side to prof/students that you don't always get in person if you only see someone twice a week. So I've experienced this additional digital connection with people who are in my own program, my own cohort, right, where I wouldn't be able to talk to them without a platform. But also, as everyone before has remarked, it is the connection to the international world of linguistics, people you would never potentially be in a room with because they're in a different subfield from you, that you really get to experience every day. And then we see other people struggling with the same things. So I know we've talked about siloing, but specifically for me as a Black biracial woman, we don't really get the opportunity to have other Black people to talk to who are also in linguistics and also struggling with just existing in the world. So that has been just a continual source of strength for me to talk to people who are struggling with the same things, who are experiencing the anxieties of just existing in academia. We also hear about strategies for dealing with other issues. So I have about 3 people who I really trust, who I've met on Twitter, who I run things by, so you can just jump into someone's DMs and be like, hey, I got this weird email, here's what I want to say, but I can't say it this way, please help me. All right, so that's really helpful for the minutia of navigating academic experiences that we aren't directly taught. And so we talk a lot about, or people talk a lot about, this challenge between personal and professional and how you behave online. And in a previous LSA webinar, Jamal Muwakil reminds us that we can't teach, read, or advise like we don't have bodies. And we're giving you the same suggestion here, right? Don't pretend like you're not a person. Don't pretend that your body doesn't navigate the way that you move through the world and how people respond to you. Be the person who is also a professional when you're online. And so thinking about people, right? Twitter is also a vector for public engagement. So that really starts with media outreach. So everyone here on this panel has been connected or contacted by media resources through Twitter to be part of an ongoing conversation. So we have another respondent who says, quote, I've been contacted to be featured in an article based on one of my tweets. And we also find that Twitter is this perfect vehicle for bridging the town and gown divide. So I personally am committed to the civic responsibility of education. All of my panelists are as well. And so we hear from people that, quote, the platform is fantastic for education and engagement with the public at large. So one space on Twitter, one account that's really done that very well is the Layman's Linguist account that is hosted by Katie Whitcomb. So Katie has an undergraduate degree in linguistics, but doesn't work in higher education now. But what she's done is really create a space for us to engage our expertise outside of our research. So she posts questions and polls and observations about popular culture and really allows linguists to just talk to the public and also other experts that are outside of our fields. So one respondent says, quote, connecting more widely with the academic community outside of linguistics, particularly on issues of pedagogy and justice, which have really been echoed when we were talking about research and teaching and networking before. And also it allows us to engage with other people who are seeking our own expertise. So cross-disciplinary organizing is really fantastic, if not essential, for the continued growth of our field. And so here we see something that we might not even search for on our own, the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, telling us not to miss an excellent opportunity to level up in math, physics, informatics, computer linguistics, or cross-disciplinary fields with their Winter Olympiad School. We also find lots of people remarking on how important Twitter has been for spreading the word about language and justice. So jumping into a conversation that's ongoing and just being like, here's a nugget about language and how it actually works has been really great. And also engaging other linguists to come with you and support you when you do that. So someone here says, I discovered my favorite Vocal Fries and other linguist podcasts, which I assign in courses. So we find a lot of this public engagement work is really being translated into curriculum and pedagogy. And so, of course, public engagement has its pitfalls. When you put yourself out there, of course, people can respond directly to you as a person. So you want to be available, make sure that you are available, but also that you're protecting your time. So you'll get to a point where you can't engage in everything that you've been tagged in, and that's okay. You can't accept every offer that's been given to you, and that's okay, right? And also, we think about, as Betsy mentioned in the beginning, Twitter as a conversation like the public square, right? So trolls obviously exist. If someone came up to you in public with a whole bunch of nonsense, you could turn right away from them and never think about them again for the rest of your life, right? That applies for Twitter as well. So I am going to turn over to Carrie, who's going to talk to us about being an institution on Twitter.
Hello, everybody. I'm also she, her. So I'm going to be talking about what it's like to tweet for the Vocal Fries. There are other kind of institutional accounts that would maybe be similar, maybe be different. So you could be running a lab, you could be running a society, etc. We get to be very snarky because of the type of thing we are, what kind of institution we are, but so we're lucky, but you might not be able to, depending on what kind of account you have. So most importantly, it's a conversation that you're engaging in with the public. And so you should respond to most things that are tweeted at you. So if someone says, hey, I've got this question, you can respond and turn it into a more of a conversation and instead of just like a one way. So if we're a podcast and we're just, you know, mostly just one way, but Twitter lets you converse both directions. And it's important to treat your audience like your friends or colleagues. Like most of our audience, well, a lot of our audience are linguists. So of course we would treat them as colleagues, but even people who are not linguists, we don't want to treat them like someone less than us, right? We want to treat them as if they're at least a friend. So one way to create community, and this is really important for a podcast, but you know, the society as well, or a lab, is to engage in topics that are relevant to whatever your mission is. So for us, you know, linguistic discrimination, if it ever comes up, we try to engage in that conversation, even if it wasn't directed at us. If we see a tweet that's relevant, we try to engage. And then this is important, I think. We need to respond like with like. So if someone tweets something, it's a good idea to tweet back to them. And if you think it's like a really sensitive topic and you don't want to talk about it in public, ask them, is it okay if I DM you and we can have a conversation elsewhere off of Twitter? But you really need to start on Twitter before you can move the conversation elsewhere. Now, there is an exception. If somebody subtweets, so subtweeting is when someone says something about someone or something, but they don't tag that person or that account, maybe you shouldn't respond. So if someone were to subtweet the vocal fries, it would really depend on what the subtweet was, but I might not respond because it might not be a productive conversation. But otherwise, I think it's a good idea to respond to tweets to you. Another thing you can use is, so if this is particularly important for labs or the society or other societies, you want to amplify research that's relevant to your mission and objectives, right? So let's say there's a paper out about, I don't know, vocal fry. Then you want to amplify that research, like, oh, hey, look, men and women use it, for example. And because language is another podcast that I think is a really cool one to check out. So, and the last one I think is really important is to crowdsource ideas from your audience to better serve your audience, right? So it's not just about us and what we think the world needs to hear. It's also about what other people think, right? So we're two white ladies. We can only cover so many topics or even think of so many topics on our own, right? So we ask others to suggest people to talk to. Okay, so here is the worst part, trolls and harassment. It's real. It's not something you can just totally ignore. And if you're younger, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, or any combination of those things, then it is more likely. It's not super likely. I've barely dealt with it myself, but it's out there and you should be aware of it. So what are some strategies you can use? Well, you can tag in accomplices. So white men have the most power, right? So if you tag them in, sometimes it can shut down the conversation. The person will say, oh yeah, you're right, and it's over, which is annoying, but it can be useful. You could mute people who are just not helping your conversation, not being productive members of the conversation, and they can't tell that you've muted them. And so, you know, it's just over. You can block and move on, especially if they're being particularly pernicious. They'll know that you've blocked them, but who cares? One of my favorite strategies is a soft block. So if someone follows you that you don't want following you, you can block them and then immediately unblock them, and they can't tell that you've done that, just that they're no longer following you. And then I think this is important for me as much as anyone to remind yourself that you're not actually really talking to the troll. You're talking to the people reading the troll's words. So sometimes it's just good to say, no, actually, this is the way the world is. You're wrong. So that other people can say, oh, that's right. I'm not alone in thinking this. All right, so general guidelines. Remember, different universes, different rules for each social media. And we're mostly talking about Twitter here. So personal email has different rules than versus work email. Remember, you just have to remember that every genre is different. Everything is public if it's on the internet, particularly on Twitter, but not just on Twitter. So remember that anything that you write can and probably will be screenshotted. I posted something once on Facebook, and yes, it got screenshotted, and the person tried to get me fired for nothing. There was nothing there, which is obviously why it didn't work, but it's real. You have to be careful. And we should be democratizing the field. We should be making everything open for everybody. Here's what our field is actually about, right? Come talk to us about language, not just professional linguists. We're trying to get other people involved, especially with our institutional account, the Vocal Prize. We do have ethical responsibilities, of course, right? Obviously, don't abuse other people on Twitter or any other account. It's not a thing that I really worry about that much, but people do it, and do not misrepresent yourself. So we've had a number of cases recently where white people have pretended to be people of color, or men have pretended to be women. Don't do that. And also don't misrepresent your particular expertise. So I'm a semanticist, I can mostly talk about that. And then also some things that I've learned from the podcast, but I would never say that I know everything there is to know about even vocal fry, right? And then, so for me, who to follow, my personal account and the vocal fries are very different. So for my personal account, I follow anybody that I find interesting at all. But for my institutional account, I try to follow other linguists or other podcasters, things that are more relevant to that. And also, like, for you want to make your experience nice. So don't just follow any random person. Make sure that they're actually making your life better. You can unfollow anyone you want at any time. So to sum up, be yourself. Don't be afraid to be yourself. Everybody wants to meet you. And the more you open yourself up, the more that people will like who you are. There's lots of things you can do with Twitter. We've talked about the teaching, we've talked about research, we've talked about networking, engaging with the community and building the community, and then what institutional accounts can do. It's all very useful. And I encourage you to get at least one Twitter account. And yeah, feel free to follow all of us on Twitter. I think that's it. So question time.
I'm actually gonna stop sharing my screen if I can. Can you guys still see my screen?
Nope, I took it away. So,
oh, great, thank you, David.
So thank you to all of our panelists, and we are now at the part of the webinar where they will take your questions. So if you have not already done so, and we do have a few questions, please ask them now using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. So I'm going to start with the first question that came in. It says, great and needed topic. One question. Let's say I'm new at Twitter and I don't have followers. How can I make sure that my tweets reach out to other linguists and that I get the feedback I'm looking for?
So I'll jump in real quick, and then anyone else can obviously jump in as well. One way to start reaching a broader audience is by using hashtags. So you can tag Linguist Twitter. One recommendation for hashtags is make sure that you capitalize the first letter in each hashtag. That makes the hashtags readable by screen readers. So you can reach a broader audience by adding a hashtag or tag in somebody who you think might be relevant. So I actually saw somebody tag in, I think Kelly and Megan earlier today, asking about how to pull in audio from a Qualtrics experiment. So you can tag people in.
And I would also say start following other linguists. They'll follow you back sometimes. You know, we're not always monitoring, you know, and following back, but you'll start getting a following that way as well.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Do you ever struggle with trying to live tweet and fully listen to or engage in the event? Like and then in parentheses, like I'm only half listening while typing this.
I just wanted to say, so Megan and I have been congratulating Artemis Lopez on the live tweeting of this thing and having a conversation about how meta it is to be having a conversation on Linguist Twitter while being panelists in a webinar about Linguist Twitter. So thanks for the live tweet.
Yes,
it might depend. Yeah, it might depend a little bit on your personal style. So what I have seen is people kind of take notes and then live tweet something a little bit later. So you'll see a little bit of a delay. That's fine if you want to give your full attention. I think if you're live tweeting something, you also don't need to feel like you have to capture absolutely everything that somebody said. So like for myself, sometimes like if there's a slide that's really great, I'll just take a picture of the slide and tweet the slide with very little commentary, so I can still kind of be there. It does depend on sort of your style, but if you're a person who is inherently prone to multitasking anyway, like I actually have trouble paying attention to one thing. So for me, being able to live tweet and being on Twitter while I'm hearing something actually helps me remember what happened better, because otherwise I am prone to spacing out and forgetting things. I don't know if other people have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can't do it at all, so I leave it to other people.
I share your, no, go for it.
Two people that are really great at it, I'm also terrible, are Jessie Grieser and Diana Davidson. So those are good first follows.
I just wanted to say I share Nicole's situation of being able to actually follow talks better when I'm live tweeting, especially because what I'm looking for when I'm live tweeting is like the big takeaway graph, right? What's the big image that I can snap a picture of and then explain in a tweet? This is the nugget of the talk, and it helps me actually focus on and try to catch what the nugget of the talk is.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Thank you all so much for this talk. It was fantastic. I was wondering that while this presentation is mainly focused on Twitter, are there some intuitions about using Linguist Instagram/TikTok? The question is for anyone and everyone.
I wish I were the kind of person who could create TikToks, because I kind of love them, but I've never really, I'm less of a visual person, I guess. I'm more of a text person personally.
One of my favorite people on TikTok is Speech Dude, whose real name I don't know, but maybe go follow him if you're a TikTok teen. I think I have heard, so my colleague where I was at before in the Claremont College's Carmen Fott did have students make like series of TikTok videos, I think, about linguistic discrimination for a project. And that in that way, the students were allowed to kind of share something with a wider audience. So they were doing kind of PSAs via TikTok. So since I was talking about teaching, I think that those kind of newer medias that maybe us like older grown-ups, people above the age of 20, aren't necessarily as like natural with, can be really useful as teaching mechanisms for students. And in fact, like they can keep us sort of informed about best practices for those mediums as well.
Okay, here's a quick question. Would you ever block another linguist? And I assume this means on Twitter.
Yeah, I have.
Cool.
Oh, my block hand is
absolutely
so strong. Like there are other things that I need to spend my time on that's not nonsense. And so like, I don't feel bad at all if somebody is acting a fool on my timeline to block them. And I don't even do the soft block. I never heard of that until Carrie said it actually, but I think it's brilliant. But I also just cannot deal with nonsense.
Same, absolutely. I use Twitter as a place to decompress and connect with people, which means I curate my feed. I want things in my feed to be informative to me and or make me happy. And if somebody is on my Twitter feed not doing one of those things or actively contributing to anti-happiness, unhappiness, I guess, I don't want that in my feed. So yeah. This isn't to say, I don't want to say like, in general, if you're not being a butthead, I don't think you really have much to worry about. So just, you know, it's like public space, just as Nicole was saying, like, or maybe Kelly was saying that, sorry, somebody said, if somebody walked up to you in public and said something ridiculous, you would not have to engage with them. And the same holds with Twitter.
Great, thanks. Here to a couple of related questions. Do you think your Twitter feed should focus mainly on linguistics, or can it also include other interests? And then in other words, would you say that it's wise or not wise to get a bit personal on your Twitter if it's not an institutional account?
I think we're all personal on our accounts as well, our personal accounts. Yeah.
I tweeted yesterday, I retweeted something that was about, do you know what outside close means? And I tweet a lot of things that like ostensibly contain African American English and therefore are adjacent to my research, but not necessarily like my research. And I was like, yes, I'm a person that does not allow outside clothes in my bed or shoes on in my house or animals in my bed. And also, I think that maybe outside clothes is a term registered for African American English speakers. So like it was related, but it wasn't related. I personally, for the people that I follow, I like when they are just also people. I don't like, you know, retweet presidential candidates or anything like that unless there is some reason that it is relevant to my research, just because like there's enough of that. And I don't really view that as like, you know, the kind of, we are all doing persona construction. We are all doing brands. It's just like not the persona that I have on Twitter to be posting stuff like that. But I don't think it's necessarily a good or bad thing either way to have a little bit of a blend of your personal and professional.
And I get pretty political on Twitter, but I'm safe in my job too. So that's another consideration that you'll want to make for yourself. I also like talking about community building. I like being open about like my anxiety and depression and all of that, because I know that someone is going to read it and be like, me too. Like maybe they don't actually say it. So I do a lot of that as well, because, you know, if you're a student or if you're just in academia or all academia, any of that, you're probably dealing with some stress, and it's nice to know that you're not alone. So I think that's part of Linguist Twitter for me, is actually sharing that personal stuff.
And people love pet pictures, and that's not linguistics at all. Like, so, I mean, I post pics of my cats and people like them. So yeah, at least some aspect of your personality. Doesn't have to be political, doesn't have to be animals, but something. I think it's a good idea to have at least one aspect of your personality.
I just want to jump in and piggyback off of what Megan just said about talking about a wide range of topics on your Twitter. We took this out of the presentation because we were worried about going a little bit long, but so I have ADHD. And because of COVID, I've been having trouble getting access to somebody who can prescribe me medication. And I complained about it on Twitter. And the next day, somebody who had seen my tweet, who was familiar with Boston area healthcare, gave me some pointers and got me like literally months earlier access to the medication that I needed, thanks to being open on Twitter and having a nice community that helps out.
Can I think it really goes back to what Betsy said about like curating your feed. I mean, this is something we maybe think more about on Instagram, but you know, I follow I'm really into space and show tunes, and I follow, you know, celebrities and other kinds of things on Twitter because it's different content. And so I don't want to have 5 pages to toggle between. So it's all kind of jumbled in, and it's part of the experience of following me, I guess.
Okay, here's sort of an etiquette question. Do you ask for permission before live tweeting talks, sharing slides, etc.?
I don't know. What do y'all think? I've never asked permission personally.
I've never done it, so.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of Betsy's original comments was about how Twitter is a public space. And so I think it might depend on the nature of the thing that you're doing. If I'm at a conference and somebody's giving a talk to 100 people, I don't feel like that's a private space, right? You know, maybe for pictures of people's faces, things like that, you might want to ask or just avoid those. But I think, you know, if you're tweeting the words only, there's probably not really an etiquette issue there.
And I think all of us kind of expected, I was going to say that I think all of us expected that this would possibly be live tweeted, or that things that we said would be shared on Twitter, and that it would be, other people would read that. And we didn't expect anyone to ask permission, I don't think. Did y'all?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, when it comes to sharing pictures of people, I try not to. So like when I'm tweeting a live talk, I try to just take a picture of the slide that's relevant if I'm sharing an image, unless I know the person. You know, sociolinguistics is a relatively small field. So oftentimes I'm live tweeting my friends' talks and I know whether they would be comfortable with me sharing their picture or not. But if I'm not sure that they would be comfortable with me sharing their picture, I try not to include them in the picture, if that makes sense.
Okay, here's a sort of a related question. When you see a tweet that you'd like to analyze for a research project, is it your ethical obligation to ask for their permission to use it? What if they don't respond or block you, troll you, etc.? Can you still use the tweet?
I think
There's Maria Heath.
I asked this question on Twitter a while ago. Not really because I felt like there was any issue, but there was a thread where people actually had their voices attached once Twitter had audio, and I wanted to use it, and I didn't think it was a problem at all. But I kind of wondered what other people thought, and it mostly came down on the side of it is a courtesy maybe to try to send a message to the original poster. But again, if you don't want the public to see your tweets, you have a private Twitter account. I also think it's, you know, if you're using it for academic research and following the general conventions of, you know, respect for persons and all of that stuff that we have to do the training for, and not making, you know, not mocking people, not making them look bad, and are sufficiently anonymizing things, then it shouldn't be necessarily a major concern. So for me personally, I have written papers where I had things from Twitter that didn't, you know, they were just data without things attached. I've also, for a paper that I did this, wrote to the original person and said, hey, would you mind if I use this? And they said no, but I didn't write to the 150 people that replied, right?
And I would just add that Twitter itself is essentially a data set. I mean, you can do an advanced search, put in names or date parameters, and it's designed that way because it's a public product. And so I feel like Nicole was saying, it's definitely a courtesy, especially if something is very personal or identifiable, the same way we'd think of any other sort of information. But lots of people use Twitter for analytics and all sorts of other data gathering. And so I don't think that the work that we do is any different.
Megan and I are writing a book, and we use tweets in that, and most of them are, you know, journalists or whatever, so they wouldn't mind at all, right? But there is one tweet where the person was not nice and we anonymized them. And I'm pretty sure that this person has deleted their tweets, so it's not really searchable. So I'm not that worried about it. And asking him would probably be a bad idea.
Okay, here's another question. Great talk. I am a PhD student. My supervisor follows me on Twitter. I'm not sure whether to tweet about my status / inquiries or even tips about my dissertation. Would you recommend that?
That is a good question. I think you have to be a little bit, you know your supervisor better than we do. You have to be a little bit careful about, I wouldn't necessarily complain about your supervisor on Twitter if they're following you or if your advisor's following you on Twitter. But that being said, it is very common to get advice about things like your dissertation or get help on ideas or get help on directions for research on Twitter. And I don't think it would be, I don't know your advisor, but it certainly would not be reasonable for anybody to hold anything like that against you, right? Using Twitter to crowdsource ideas or methodologies.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the people on here are advisors to people, and I know that they wouldn't mind to hear that their students are struggling with their dissertation or whatever. Actually, I think all of us kind of expect that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would say, again, I would echo what Betsy said about, your advisor best. But I have seen advisors and advisees interact on Twitter, and it has been very supportive as far as I've seen. So I think that's kind of a judgment call on that relationship.
I think if you're at all concerned about it, one criteria might be like, okay, would I be having this conversation at a department reception where people could overhear? Like, if you're looking for a heuristic, that might be the one that I would use. And of course, that does depend on your relationship with your advisor and the culture of your department and things like that. But you do remember that it's a public space. I wouldn't, again, as Megan said, I think this is very normal and people, as Betsy said, shouldn't hold it against you. But, if you're looking for a heuristic, that might be what I would go with.
Great. Here's a question. I think it refers to someone's answer to a previous question, so maybe whoever it was can supply the answer. The question is, what was the name of that TikTok user?
Oh, speech dude. Yeah.
And I'm just gonna send that to everybody in the audience.
I wish I knew his real name. Now I gotta give me a moment. I'll find out and put it in the chat.
Okay. Let's see. And then next one, could any of you speak to the potential Twitter has to connect racially minoritized linguists and the kind of community that emerges from that?
So I mentioned that a little bit in my section, and for me personally, it's been just an incredible boon to connect with other minoritized people. First of all, I didn't realize how many of us there were. So you really start to feel isolated and you don't notice. And some of the other things that people have been talking about, like dealing with anxiety issues and health issues, that's also been, a silent minority that I've now connected myself to. It's been very helpful. You find like Twitter trends or like things that are going on, like in the summer, the hashtag Black in the Ivory really expanded like my network of minoritized scholars in many different fields, people I absolutely never would have met without those connections that are people I now consider friends, right? So I really do think most of the minoritized scholars that I know from Twitter now.
And I've found it very lovely to connect with other Latinx people that are on Linguist Twitter, and yeah, it's really lovely to know that those people are out there. And like Kelly said, I didn't know there were so many Latinx people that were doing linguistics because we've kind of pushed them out to other fields like anthropology and education and all of this. So it's been a really great way to connect.
Here's a good question. What should linguists avoid doing on Twitter and other platforms?
Being an asshole?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Don't be an asshole.
Well, and you know, like we can be specific about that. I would say, you know, one thing that really bothers me is people kind of not recognizing their power dynamics. So like I am faculty. I would never say something negative about a student on Twitter. Like, first of all, yeah, don't be an asshole. But second of all, that's an abuse of power, right? And sometimes people think of Twitter as like the Wild West, like this person said this, I'm gonna snark back and da 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 da. No, like these things still have the power to reproduce inequality sort of in the real world as it is. And so you know, I don't want to be like, recognize your positionality, but like that's exactly what I mean.
One thing I also don't like is, you know, being mean about different kinds of linguistics. Like, that's not a good look. Like, yes, we can talk about theories and like hash it out, but I don't know, just being like blanket, this whole theory is bad. I don't like that, and I don't think we should do it.
Okay, here is a good question. Sorry, let me scroll back to it. Have you ever learned something that made you realize years-old tweets were incorrect or problematic? Have you gone back years later to remove things, or how do you handle that if it's not corrected in real time?
So this is a really, I think the question is asking like, if I, Betsy Sneller, tweet something that later on I, Betsy Sneller, realize is problematic or harmful, what do you do about it? And there's basically two schools of thought. One is, you know, delete it. It's harmful. The other is, and I think for me, it would land on how active the tweet was. If nobody responded to it, then just delete it. It doesn't need to be in the universe. If it's a conversation, it's important to accept responsibility for harm that you put out in the world. So the second school of thought is keep it up for accountability and comment on it and say, hey, everyone, FYI, this was wrong for these reasons.
Here's a good question. How much time do each of you spend a day on Twitter in order to be engaged?
Well, that's a really rude question.
Don't at me.
I do a lot of reading and not that much posting personally, so too much time. I don't know.
Yeah, too much time. But you don't have to do that to yourself. There are great apps that can like make it so, like, I know that the iPhone does it. So if you have like, you can set the time that you're allowed to have in certain things, and then it'll kick you off. And I always say, just kidding, not this time. Go away. I need more time. But there are those kind of things, and you should always be aware of your mental health when you're like, if you need to step away, step away. I wish I would take my own advice sometimes, but yes, you don't have to spend your whole day on there.
Switch to TikTok and enjoy the videos.
Sometimes I just, you know, like there are beats of my day where I'm like, oh, you know, let's see what's going on over at Twitter. Like, you know, in the 10 minutes I have between classes or whatever. And so you can do it with your scraps of time. Also, you know, if you have some followers, you know that if you tweet something that's like a hot take, you're gonna get a lot of responses. So don't tweet a hot take before you have to like go give a talk if it's gonna be distracting to you. Like save your hot takes for when you have time to respond to them.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to read a very short comment. You have a convert. It says, I've been on the fence about joining Twitter for a long time. I think this is going to tip me into getting an account. I look forward to interacting with this community. And then maybe just sort of parting words. We've got more questions than we have time to answer, but several of the remaining ones deal with, again, this notion of sort of a public persona versus a private persona. If you have, you know, you might have an existing Twitter account that has a different focus. how do you separate the personal and the professional? You know, how many Twitter accounts do you consider having? All that kind of thing.
I mean, it's a good idea if you're worried at all to have a second account that's purely private, like not private. You can set it to be private, but I more mean like, here's my private persona, and then you can have a separate account that's your more public-facing persona. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I have both a public Twitter and a public Instagram. And my Instagram is, you know, it's like, I know that everybody's there, but it's definitely like, look at how I went apple picking, right? It's not like, let me tell you my like hard linguistic theories. And so I just use the different platforms for different things. But, you know, I'm still myself across them. The content that I post is different.
And I guess
I don't have an alt. Oh, go for it.
I guess just one thing to know is people can see who you follow. So if that's something that you want to keep private, then have a different account. I truly don't know anyone who is going to somebody's page, clicking and reading all of their followers. Like, that's creepy, but
No, people do it.
Oh, I'm sure. But yeah, that's just, I guess, just another thing to think about. If you want to follow a group of people that you don't want your professional community to know about, then that's why you make another one.
Excellent
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't personally have an alt account, but I think a lot of people do. And there's a number of reasons to have an alt account, right? So if you are following a community that you want to keep relatively separate from your academic community, that's a great reason to set up an alt account. There's also a number of like alt accounts for the purpose of being a little bit more acerbic, right? Making like slightly more hot takes that you don't necessarily want associated with yourself. It's a pretty common thing to do.
And if you're studying a community that you don't want to be associated with, like let's say you're studying white supremacists, like, ugh, not for me, but someone needs to. Maybe you don't want that associated with your regular account at all, even though it's part of your professional life. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a hard time. I would have a hard time separating if I tried. So my public account, I have a public Twitter account, and I say, you know, from share pics of my dogs, and then also have like my hot takes. Again, I have the security in my job, and I think that's just a really important thing to think about. If I know several people who have 2 different accounts, and no one's going to fault you for that. We totally get why you would do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, great. Thanks very much to our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And many thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to be with us. There were a number of questions that didn't get answered. I've just sent around a link to the web page that we have on the LSA website for this webinar, and that has contact information for the panelists. We'll have a recording of this webinar available soon, no later than Monday afternoon, and we'll let you know when it's ready. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks.